Ursula Villarreal Moura's chapbook collection of interconnected stories is only 53 pages long, but it offers flash stories spanning 3 decades, from the 1990s to the present day, and settings in San Antonio and beyond. Points of view vary from first to second to third. The subject matter also varies and offers interesting dualities, stark sadness and dark humor. Callow, wide-eyed narrators alongside older and wiser ones still trying to figure out life's unanswerable questions. It's a little book that packs a tremendous punch. This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. I spoke to Ursula Villarreal Moura about her book, Math for the Self-Crippling.
Okay, so this piece is called Blood Paisley's 1990. Do you remember when drive-by shootings were an epidemic in San Antonio? When in middle school, every morning you'd greet your gaggle of friends by saying, "You survived the bullets, you nasty gangbangers." And they replied with quips like, "Yeah, I'm thug like that." Or, "I was wearing my Crips colors, fool." Only you were all 12-year-old private school girls, scared by the local nightly news, sick by the body counts in the newspaper headlines. Some of you were Mexican American, some of you were white. All of you were equally fascinated by your uncivilized city as you were by your newfound period blood. Whenever an errant Blood Paisley stained a skirt or gym shorts, the group issued a warning to the victim. "Vato, you've been shot near the buttocks, get help." Gangs were the rage, initiations were never ending, and you were held hostage in the prime of puberty. This was before you began describing hip hop as iambic, before you seriously considered the idea of leaving San Antonio, years before you developed your insulated New England daydream. The prospect of staying in your bloody city, well, that was a chalk outline you could draw in your sleep.
So your book is called Math for the Self-Crippling. That's a pretty enigmatic title on the surface. And these are fiction stories. They're interconnected stories. But can you tell us what that title means, or what does it mean, at least in terms of the way that you conceived the collection, or the way that you even talk about the collection to other people?
Sure. So I'm someone who thinks titles are very important, and I work with undergraduate students, and a lot of times even when they write a paper and they're not taking it seriously, they don't even give it a title. And so I'm someone who is always telling them, put a title, even if it's not the final one, you'll come back to it, but it'll feel more official once you have a title. And so I knew that I wanted a title that people would remember or that was unique in some way. And I have a story within the collection called Math for the Self-Crippling. And it felt like that was the title that could encompass the entire book for various reasons. I felt that it was memorable. It kind of implies kind of a frustration that I think is embedded in some of these stories. And also just the idea of struggle and mental health. There's a thread of mental health within the book, and especially in the Latino community, I feel like that's pretty much ignored or kind of, put under the rug. And I wanted that to come through and to be vulnerable, and for the title to be vulnerable, because that was just an important theme in the book.
I agree. There's so many things. I mean, the idea of stigma in the Latino community around mental health, I think that's such an important idea. And so many other things, and some things about San Antonio and et cetera. But I want to talk to you first about flash fiction. This seems to be a kind of storytelling that you return to again and again. And I think sometimes people might misunderstand what flash fiction is all about, or what it can afford you as a writer and as a storyteller, and even what it can afford to us, to readers. So, can you talk a little bit about how you work in flash fiction and why that's a form that you return to?
Sure. I have to say that flash fiction was a form that I was aware of, but I didn't really embrace. And when I was in graduate school, I took a class my first semester, and we had to read an entire anthology of flash fiction. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is like the most hated book I could ever read right now. I wanted long stories, and I really believed that a complete story had to be between 4 and 16 pages. And, as I read the flash fiction anthology with the class and we discussed it, I started to get convinced that a story could be told, a very compelling and interesting story could be told within 1,000 words. And, it was a very hard revelation for me because I fought it. I was such a defensive learner. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to hold on to this very rigid concept that stories were 4 pages long, at least. And some of the stories in the anthology that I read that convinced me were actually written in other languages, and they had been translated into English and included among, American writers. And I was very um, fascinated with how a writer could have such build a world in so few words and leave an impact on the reader. And it just became kind of an obsession for me, just because at first I hated it so much and resisted it. And then I wanted to know, like, how can they trick me, or how can they do this magic on me? And I tried to teach myself how to write flash for a few years. And um, I probably revised my first story, flash story, like something like 75 times or something, just because I was teaching myself. And it wasn't so much about the story itself, but like every, I realized every word is important, every sentence is important, every paragraph has to transition in a way that's meaningful. And so I kind of fell in love with the form just because I really wanted, it was like a nut I needed to crack. And so I just started writing all these flash stories just so I could learn the form. And before I knew it, I had an entire book.
Wow. I mean, Flash is one of those things I think people have some, um, people misunderstand what it's about, or they think it's easy, or you can just like crank these stories out. And that's really not true. I mean, I tend to think that, I mean, it's almost much harder to write a really good Flash piece. I don't know. And it is time consuming. It's not, it's like the same way I feel about poetry. Like to write a poem is not an easy thing, I have to say. Um, so I like this idea about, trying to solve the puzzle of it for yourself as a reader and figuring things out about it on your own. And the idea of work in translation, I think, is also really compelling where flash fiction is concerned. Um, but this book is a collection of these linked short flash pieces, stories that move us from the speaker's childhood through to adulthood. And it's interesting in that we don't really see like this totally fluid, complete chronology around, large and small events. Instead, they come to us as these moments of almost like imperceptible conflicts or tensions, even traumas. I find that so interesting just in terms of process, this idea of like the really small and subtle things that are magnified here that
Mhm.
make up like the individual story. And it's like this, gorgeous necklace of all these smaller beads. What was your process like with this book? Like, did you know the full story of the book, or were you writing towards something in your process? What was that like for you?
You know, when I first started the stories in this book, like I said, I was just trying to teach myself Flash. I was just trying to write something compact and compelling and maybe have some kind of memorable imagery in there. And so I didn't when I first, the first maybe 5 pieces I wrote, I didn't even think I could write a flash book. And so I didn't really have a goal at the beginning. It was only after I had maybe published maybe 8 to 10 of these pieces that I started to think, this is it's building a constellation, it's building a narrative. And it was all happening subconsciously when I was writing them. I wasn't linking them in my head per se, but they were all kind of fitting together. Um, and so, probably around 2017 or so, 2016, I started, just playing around with the order of them and putting them together in a Word document and reading them to see if it made any sense, if they were in conversation with each other. And to my surprise, they kind of were. Um, the version that got published by Goldline is a different version than the one that I put together in 2017. It's very similar. Um, but yeah, I would say it wasn't until maybe 5 years, 4 or 5 years after I started writing the first pieces that I envisioned it as a book.
But it does have that movement, as you say. Like, we're so invested in the character from the beginning, and it's not necessarily like this, like, I don't know, like House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros, like this vignette, the string of vignettes that's like, hers. That book's a Bildungsroman, right? And we sort of stay with this young character through this formative time. But in this book, it's sort of like we move even beyond that to some really complex stories that are related to relationships and college, and we see that the character is an adult now, and it's just such an interesting thing to move from story to story, and even have a sense of the character in a very real way, and getting to know her, and then watching her in these other situations as an adult. It's just really interesting. And it's sort of like you're reading, and before you know it, you look up and you're thinking, oh, she's been through so much already. and and now, life is still really hard for her. So there's a lot of resonance there, let me tell you. So I enjoyed coming to that discovery at a certain point near the end of the book. I was sort of like, but she still has this very, um, she's very observant. She's very sensitive. She's very watchful. All of these qualities that she had as a child. I really love the way that they come through in these vignettes where she's older and in these other situations, in a new place, away from home, in a new country, in a new relationship. Right? It's really remarkable.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that I wanted, I think that for a lot of women, particularly women of color, and maybe even Latinas, since that's my own experience, I can only speak to that. Um, there is a lot of hardship navigating through everything, through childhood, through being bullied, through romantic relationships, maybe getting the short end of the stick at work, too. I know Latinos are paid less than any woman in America. So there's just a lot of, whether they be intentional slights or, systemic, problems that that really can affect a person. And I didn't want it to be a really down book in any way. I wanted it to be realistic, but I tried to infuse some sort of like dry humor or wit in there to balance or offset some of the more some of the heavier pieces, because obviously I feel like there's always a little bit of levity necessary, that gets us through life. And I wanted that to come through a bit. Hopefully it does. But Yeah, I think that in a lot of ways it's kind of a realistic book because there's just so many there's so many moments in life where you think like, wow, like was that intentional? Did that like is it me or would this have happened to anyone? And I think probably everyone can relate to those instances.
Well, I do have to agree that there are those moments of dry humor, almost like the absurdity of life sometimes in the ways that we have to negotiate certain things. That does come through, along with, some very weighty, realistic elements. Um, I read an interview online on the site called Necessary Fiction that you did, and you were asked to describe your research for the book. And you explained four key areas related to the book: houses, dreams, therapy, and mysticism. Uh, so, if you're listening to this, everybody out there, that alone is worth reading. Just your answers to that particular prompt. So I made a list of a few concepts, and I wonder. So it's unfair on the spot to ask you to do this, but let's see where this goes. If you might talk to us a little bit about these terms, these ideas, these prompts in terms of your research and your writing, and you can say pass, and we'll go on to the next one. Let's see how
Okay.
it goes. So I have family, San Antonio, school, and travel. And I'm going to save the last one, but pick any one of those that you'd like that you want to talk about, just in terms of your research and your writing: family, San Antonio, school, and travel.
I want to start with San Antonio.
Oh, good.
Um, so I grew up in San Antonio, obviously, born and raised there. And I always wanted to be a writer. And the writers, I obviously read Sandra Cisneros and loved her. And she was she did a reading near, near my high school, actually. And I went to see her read out loud. And it was just a magical experience. But this is going to sound crazy, but because she was local and because I could go see her, I didn't realize how universally she was read. I thought she was just someone from our neighborhood or someone from our city, like a local legend. I didn't realize that she was being, you know, assigned, her books were being assigned in school and stuff. And so it wasn't until many years later that I thought, oh my gosh, how fortunate am I that I got to see Sandra Cisneros being read. But aside from Sandra, I didn't know any writers who lived in San Antonio. I didn't, it all seemed like an impossible dream in a way. And so um, I thought if I ever become a writer, going to write about San Antonio. And I wholeheartedly believe that I've been shaped by San Antonio. And so I wanted to write stories in which there was a Latina protagonist who wasn't what a lot of books show us of Latina protagonists with super troubled families, or they're, you know, really outspoken women, shouting in the streets and stuff. I wanted there to be kind of a introverted Latina living her life in San Antonio. That was my dream because I had never read a book exactly like my lived experience. And I had read a lot of books. And so I decided I was going to do that, write stories that took place in San Antonio that reflected what an introverted Latino would experience. And so that was central to this book.
And family, school, or travel? Should we try one more?
Yeah, let's try. Yvette, I'm gonna let you pick.
I'm going to choose travel because it is a part of this book, I I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about travel.
Yeah, I lived in San Antonio for 18 years and I didn't even get on a plane until I was 14. And I got on a plane with my grandmother. She went to go visit a relative in California. And then I didn't get on a plane again until I was 18 and going to college. And I had decided to go to college out of Texas. I went to college in Vermont, to Middlebury College. I had taken family trips to Mexico as a child and as a teenager, but I had never explored even the United States. And so that was a dream of mine to live in another place and to see who I was in another place. And so I went to school in New England. It wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be, but I stuck it out. Um, and then as an adult, I decided, this is kind of an opportunity for me to explore some more. And so I did travel a lot. And I found um, that even though I'm definitely shaped by San Antonio, there's so much to see and experience. And I feel like someone's perception could so easily be enhanced by seeing other people's way of life, other cities, other ways of being. And so I'm fortunate that I have traveled a lot. Um, and I wanted to share that in my writing because I think that especially for a book that spends a lot of time in San Antonio, um, it's important that not everyone's the same in San Antonio. And even though we may all have a similar background in terms of our, a lot of people are descended from Mexico. There's such a variety of experiences, and I wanted this character to be someone who had spent her life there, been shaped there, and then decided to leave. Um, and then, come back, visit her old house. They always say you can't come back home, but of course you can, but you're just a different person. And that was a goal of mine to see that evolution of who she was from being picked on by cholas to then returning and having experiences on the highway with her husband and then in a job.
This is a work of fiction, but I think you've explained it just even in terms of your own lived experiences. And I love this idea because I'm someone who really believes that when you go somewhere, when you travel someplace, when you're in a new space, you really do bring yourself. You are yourself in that space. So there's something that I really like about this idea that this character who's so shaped by a lot of different things in San Antonio, everywhere she goes, as I'm reading the story, I'm feeling like she is still her full and whole self in this new place, even though I feel like when she returns to San Antonio, she's still who she was, but as you say, she's changed. There's like this sort of new layer of who she is that's coming now back. Everywhere she goes, she's just who she is, including when she returns to San Antonio. I just love this idea of really getting to know this character and sort of moving through the narrative and coming to the last page and feeling like even though there's still a lot of mystery here, there's still a lot that that there's no tidy endings. It's not going to be revealed to us. It just doesn't work that way. Life doesn't work that way, and literature doesn't either. But that we feel a little closer to understanding some of the conflicts and some of the losses that she's moving through in her life. The last one I want to ask you, and I was saving this one, is books,
Mhm.
masterpieces, art, writing, books. What does that say to you? Like in terms of your research and your writing, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think they're interconnected, to be honest, because the penultimate story in the book is called Masterpieces, and in the story, the narrator is at work, and there's, I guess, some work drama going on, and she says that she's tempted to shout, in the grand scheme of life, I'm tempted to shout, a job is a footnote, it is a means, not a Michelangelo. And so she's referencing art, obviously, art history. Um, so yeah, I'm someone obsessed with art, obviously. I, used to spend a lot of time in museums. When I lived in New York, I went to the museum, to different museums, probably once or twice a week. Um, the MoMA in New York, when I lived there, always had these really great international films being aired in their tiny little theater, and I would go after work. And I just felt like my life was so rich because I wasn't writing at the time, but I was constantly surrounding myself with art. Um, so I think that, especially when people are depressed or in a deficit, or just don't feel very creative, to be around art is really powerful. If we have like a God-sized hole or some sort of, hole or sadness, I feel like art really does play a role in maybe filling it, at least temporarily, for ourselves. It did for me for a while. I like I can't even say that it's just restricted or limited to museums, because I'm obsessed also with reading manga.
Mm-hmm.
And so I read manga quite a lot. And this past Saturday, I spent the whole day reading a collection of manga on the couch, like 400 pages. And I just love being transported. And, some of the scenarios are very unrealistic in some of the things that, some of the art that I enjoy. But I just love that element of imagination. I love that escape. I'm somebody who listens to music a lot. Sometimes they make playlists for running, that start in English and then transition to Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something really magical about language. I think the human brain is just so fascinating that, even for bilingual speakers, the ability to switch languages mid sentence or mid conversation is fascinating to me. So I love listening to language. I love reading books in translation because, like I said, I feel like there's so many people from so many different countries are exploring different forms, even in writing. I think we have these traditions that sometimes we're not even aware of, whether it's, starting a story a particular way or ending with a, hanging, suspenseful ending that we might not fully be processing. But once we're introduced to something that's radically different, then we have this awareness, oh, this is the way that we tell stories here. But in other places, stories are told, non-linear, in a non-linear way, or they start with this, or there's just so much variation, I think, within different types of art forms, writing in particular. So I think that there's so many masterpieces in so many genres.
So the first time I read your book, I underlined, in the grand scheme of life, a job is a footnote. It is a means, not a Michelangelo. And I thought, that's the tattoo, or, that's the T-shirt or the bumper sticker. But I feel also like to come to, where you are in your writing career, and I know you're also a teacher, is this idea of that young girl in San Antonio, perhaps listening to Sandra Cisneros reading, the idea of not to pay it forward. I don't mean it like that necessarily, but what is, and I'm sure you have lots of really good advice for your students. But what is something that you can share with our listeners around what reading means to you, or what writing means to you, if there's that young 12-year-old girl out there listening to this podcast episode? What do you have to say?
I would say enjoy other people's imaginations and your own. I think that's the key. I think there's so many ways to escape into really interesting um, scenarios, just through reading, through watching movies, through music. It's fascinating to leap into someone else's version of the world. And I think that's the beauty of life, being aware of all the different lenses through which we can view the world.
Ursula, thank you so much for talking to me. It's such a pleasure to talk to you about all of these fantastic ideas in your book, Math for the Self-Crippling.
Thank you for having me, Yvette. It was a pleasure.
Ursula Villarreal Moura is the author of Math for the Self-Crippling. It's published by Goldline Press. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. We had help from David Martin Davies. I'm Yvette Benavides.